Welcome to the book discussion of Maadi, The Making and Unmaking of a Cairo Suburb, 1878 till 1962, with the author Annalise DeVries. I'm Suzan Kenawy, Marketing Manager at the American University in Cairo Press. This webinar should take around 1 hour, and we will begin by introducing the book. Then the author will talk about the book for around 20 minutes or so. Then we'll open the floor to some questions from our audience. And please, if you do have a question, you can type it in the Q&A box. You can find it at the lower bottom part of your screen. And we've also have received some questions prior to the event, so hopefully we could get them answered. But let me first introduce our author and moderator for our event. Okay. The author, Annalise DeVries, is the assistant professor of world history at Stanford University in Birmingham, Alabama, where she teaches classes on modern Middle East, women history, and global history. She's also the program coordinator for Stanford's Global and Cultural Studies program. She received her PhD in history from Rutgers University in 2013. Since completing her book on the history of Maadi, she has been working on a new project about a solar-powered engine unveiled in Maadi in 1913. Her work on Maadi also inspired a project closer to her home in the US, and she runs a digital history project on the history of a Rosedale neighborhood outside of Birmingham called the Rosedale Memory Project. Our moderator today is Nadia Naqib. She is the senior commissioning editor at the American University in Cairo Press, where she acquires scholarly and general interest books in Middle East studies. Please join me in welcoming Annalise and Nadia. And now I will leave the floor to my colleague, Nadia. Nadia, over to you.
Thank you, Susan. It's really a pleasure to give a very warm welcome to Annalise and to everybody who's joined us for this discussion of her book, Maadi, The Making and Unmaking of a Cairo Suburb, 1878 to 1962, just published by the American University in Cairo Press last month. This is a fascinating and wonderfully written social and economic history of Maadi, which takes us from the founding of the suburb under the aegis of the British occupation right until 1962, when the Egyptian Delta Land and Investment Company, which had founded Maadi, was nationalized by the Egyptian government. The book is full of colorful and fascinating characters, colonial administrators, resident foreigners, powerful business people, and members of the Egyptian elite, all of whom either benefited from or lived in Maadi at one time or another. Annalise DeVries skillfully combines this storytelling with an account of how the world of Maadi was profoundly influenced by the political, social, and economic transformations that were taking place within the country at large, and by Egypt's place within the wider global international economy. So I urge you all to buy and read this book, and we'll leave details for where you can buy your copy in the chat box below. And now I'll turn the mic over to Annalise DeVries. The floor is yours, Annie. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Nadia. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to AUC Press, especially to Suzanne and Ingrid Wassman too, for all of your help in putting this together. I'm really excited. I would like to open with a simple question, what was Maadi? Many of you who have been familiar with or lived in Maadi for a long time know that what it is today is quite different from what it used to be. So I'm going to share my screen here so we can, I've got some slides. There we go. To answer my question of what was Maadi, I actually want to turn to these dates that are in the title. 1878 to 1962 are not necessarily the typical dates you see associated with Egyptian history. And then there's a reason for that. Historians really focus on context. And with that, time matters profoundly. And Maadi's story asks us to think about a different timeline So I have these sort of more familiar dates of and sort of images associated with them in Egyptian, especially political history. If I started here with 1878, why not 1882, when the British occupation began? Why 4 years earlier? One of the main things I'm tracing, and something Nadia mentioned, is that this is the economic relationships that shaped this neighborhood. So well before the military occupation began, Egypt was already economically occupied. In 1878, representatives from foreign governments began surveying Egypt to find better means for tax extraction. They were worried that Egypt would not be able to pay its debts. And so after this basically real estate survey that they undertook, Egypt ended up with a dual control by the British and French over their entire budget. The new budget that these foreigners set up was led in part by one of Maadi's founders, a man named Sir Auckland Colvin, who actually didn't live in Egypt especially long, but was heavily involved in its financial administration. So he was part of a plan to basically extract more money from Egypt. And so they slashed state services profoundly in order to get their Egyptian debt repaid to foreign governments. And they especially slashed the military budget. So this image I have here is of the surrendering of Arabi to General Drury Low. This happened in 1882, but Arabi's revolution actually started just a year after this dual control started in 1879. So, just starting with those financial linkages helps us get a more robust Egyptian story that doesn't just start with the British occupation, but actually starts with the resistance movement by the Egyptians. Maadi's story helps us see the financial context of a lot of those political transformations, things that wouldn't necessarily appear in a typical textbook, not even a Middle East history textbook. So then let's jump to the latter date, and this will kind of give us the bookends of what I'm going to talk about here. Excuse me. What about 1962? I have this image here of Nasser and Sadat after the 1952 revolution. Other, of course, very significant dates to the decolonization of Egypt and Egyptian independence are 1956 and the Suez Canal crisis, which has been all over the news because of the recent events in the Suez, or you could even move into the latter part of the 1960s and conflicts with Israel. But Maadi again draws us to a different context. And in this case, it is the closing of Egypt's private sector under Gamal Abdel Nasser and the nationalization of private businesses, especially those with British or French ownership. 1962 marked the end of a second wave of nationalizations and included the dissolution, as Nadia mentioned, of the Egyptian Delta Land and Investment Company. I'm going to refer to that as Delta Land, but that company was popularly known as the Maadi Company. The history of that company is really the context of the story in my book. Delta Land changed the landscape of Greater Cairo and profited from an idea of modern Egypt that was appealing to both foreigners and Egyptians. So to shed some light on this history and give you an idea of some of the content of the book, I want to talk about 4 places in Maadi that I hope will capture some of the personalities in the neighborhood and the changes that unfolded there. So I'll kind of move through these. The first one was a large villa, as you can tell, called the Grove. This is one of the very first homes built in Maadi. And this is very significant to that broader financial history of the area. So this was the home of a man named John W. Williamson. He built this large Gothic style villa for his family not long after he joined Delta Land's board of directors in 1906. So he built the home, they began living in it by 1908. So really early in Maadi's history, if you think about it, them establishing Maadi in 1904. The villa really speaks of the impressive wealth in Maadi, as well as the commitment to a garden-rich, very verdant environment. So Williamson really represents a very special demographic in Maadi's history. I mentioned before Sir Auckland Colvin, this clear connection to empire in terms of the British administration of Egypt, especially that financial connection that precedes the military occupation. But Colvin never lived in Maadi. He actually left the board before this home was even built. Williamson was a sort of second generation of leadership in the company. And he came, when he joined the board, he represented a group of what we call Levantines. These are foreigners who have taken up residence in the Ottoman Empire, especially its port cities, for centuries. Their history in the Levant, in the Eastern Mediterranean, goes back to the 17th century, late 17th century. And the Williamsons are part of this long lineage of British families. They maintain their sort of Britishness, but they his particular branch of the family had lived in Smyrna, which is now Izmir in Turkey. And he was starting to look for new economic opportunities and kind of, he's an interesting guy. He had several failed businesses, and Delta Land was probably his greatest success. He moved from Smyrna to Cyprus, and then Alexandria, and then down to Cairo. His movement actually represents this expansion of Cairo as a really favorable place for foreign investments. There's an important detail to all of the history of Maadi, and it's called the capitulations, or they are called the capitulations. This is a financial policy put in place by the Ottoman Empire that granted foreign merchants exemption from a lot of local taxes and exemption from the jurisdiction of local courts. For Ottoman purposes, it made sure that foreigners were constantly competing against one another in Ottoman ports. So then no one power became dominant, like you see happen with the British in India. The British displaced the Portuguese and then colonized the whole subcontinent. That doesn't happen in the Ottoman Empire because they're all kind of competing with each other. Well, it does, though, disproportionately advantage foreigners who are involved in trade over locals. So there is a real tension. There's an inequality built into that system that will have sort of a long history. Those capitulations are in place in Egypt because it was a territory of the Ottoman Empire until 1914. So because foreigners can get those capitulation benefits, they're moving increasingly into Egypt while the British military are there, because that military occupation makes Egypt seem like a more stable economic investment. So this home is really representative of those kinds of foreign interests. They're not the straightforward government representative type interests, straight out of government civil service. They are invested in business. Because they're invested in business, they are interested in local development rather than just extraction. They're interested in local development, but in a way that still is committed to a significant social inequality that was prominent and rapidly aging in Ottoman lands. And the capitulations stick around in Egypt for longer than anywhere else because so many foreign interests are invested in keeping them around. So the British can't abolish them. They stick around until 1949. So that's an important detail we'll come back to. Anyway, Williamson and this home and this initial establishment of Maadi is representative of what I call these resident foreigners and their presence in Cairo and in Egypt. They have other names by other historians have given them other terms to describe them, but that resident foreigner, they are resident in Egypt. They are committed to a life in Egypt and see their future as connected to Egypt, but they also, that future they envision also rests on them maintaining foreign nationality and foreign citizenship. So there's a real, there is a divide there, and they have that sort of divided identity. The Grove and Maadi's early development was focused on this class of foreigners, and more of them moved to Cairo looking to make a profit. But Maadi's appeal did not remain limited to the small segment of Egyptians, to that small segment of Egyptian society. Oops, there we go. The next place that I want to look at is, especially for long-time Maadi residents, this is the centerpiece of Maadi's social life, and that's the club. The Maadi Sporting Club is the fixture and really the symbol in so many ways of this earlier existence of Maadi. How this place came into being, though, actually we have to, again, give some context. It's established in 1920. And so that's another weird year. It's a year right after a massive nationwide revolution in Egypt in 1919. So to tell the story of the club, we actually have to tell a bit of the story of World War I. And World War I, I'm sure as many of you know, is transformative for the history of Egypt, for the history of the Middle East broadly, and Maadi absolutely participates in that. So during the war, the outskirts of Maadi were turned into a base for British imperial troops, especially for Australians bound for Gallipoli. So we have actually quite a bit of significance of Maadi to Australian history as well. Because of the severity of British imperial dominance during the war, and actually the really poor behavior of Australian troops in Egypt, Egypt emerged from the war with a nationwide call for independence. And as I mentioned, this culminates in that 1919 revolution. So the sporting club then shows up just a year later. Is this just an act of sort of British imperialism, them trying to sort of preserve themselves? Actually, the club has a much broader significance. And it is what I would argue is a very important place for the intersection of interests, both of those resident foreigners like Williamson, as well as locals. And so Maadi, after the war, Delta Land could no longer profit from just appealing to resident foreigners like Williamson. They had to pivot, and they needed more local appeal. And one of the ways that they were really able to do this is by appealing to a growing class of the Egyptian, a growing Egyptian middle class and Egyptian intelligentsia, known as the Effendiya. After the war, one of the ways that they find a real appeal across those cultural and political and even economic divides is through the spaces like the club. It's not religious, and it offers shared space for activity. It really helps identify Maadi with physical action, sporting life, and especially as the other picture shows. So this is the clubhouse, the smaller picture, and then the other pictures, of course, of the pool. And the pool is one of the memories that came up in interviews I did most frequently. You can see all the children though. And so this was, it's a space for families, and Maadi as that suburban space where you can have your family and then you can go to work in the city. But this is a place where you have a garden and you can ride your bike and everyone knows each other. This is the time really right after World War I that a lot of those memories of a kind of semi-rural paradise kind of emerged, because by that point too, if we think just ecologically, the trees are all, much bigger than they were when they were first planted. The gardens are much more robust. The roads are better paved. All of the like important pieces of developing Maadi now are fully functioning. And the club then is just the signature, sort of the finishing piece, the top of the cake. In the interwar years, then this club actually really stood out because the Gezira Club had been, all Egyptian members were forced to leave. It was segregated and by the British later. So they imposed this segregation at the Gezira Club. So we have also a lot of well-to-do Egyptian families who don't live in Maadi coming to the club. If you're familiar with the scholarship of Edward Said, a very famous and influential really author and creator of the concept of Orientalism, and as it relates to post-colonial theory. He grew up in Cairo, and he didn't live in Maadi, but this club was a fixture of his life. It really in many ways represents this pivot of Maadi away from just a resident foreigner place, just a foreign commercial space, like it would have been associated with the Grove, and to a more Egyptian space, bourgeois and middle-class Egyptian space, but it becomes much more shared. And it is a fascinating period, but it's a complicated one. During these interwar years, it really appears that Egyptian independence is on the way. By 1936, the British have arrived at a new Anglo-Egyptian treaty. They limit their military presence in Egypt to just the Suez, which they agree they will leave in 20 years. So that will be 1956. This is all going to kind of come full circle. It seems that this is in many ways an embodiment of the future of Egyptian independence, where foreign capital might still be welcome, but Egyptians will increasingly run the state systems. And I think the club life reflects a bit of that vision. It's important to note, though, that 1 year after that Anglo-Egyptian treaty in 1937, there's another treaty, a little lesser known one called the Montreux Treaty. And this treaty is the agreement for the end of the capitulations. The end of the capitulations is essential to Egyptian independence. And some of Egypt's most prominent and especially strongest, I would argue, nationalist leaders are really focusing on the end of the capitulations and economic independence. I think they see that long story of economic occupation before military occupation. And so in the treaty negotiations, the agreement is that there's a 12-year transitional period. So the capitulations will end, but it's not until 1949. So they know that that end is coming, and that'll be an important piece of the sort of next story. So this all seems really idyllic. Of course, though, World War II changes much of this, and we get sort of this other shift. It's not a transformation, but it's just another like era, another phase in Maadi's history. The Delta Land Company is still very much in charge of Maadi at this time, but we get a transformation, a movement more in an intentionally nationalist, Egyptian nationalist direction that sees less space for the kind of foreign influence that used to exist, and that really Maadi was founded on. So these are architectural drawings from Hassan Fatih, that from two different projects in Maadi. One is of a village, that's the bigger picture, and the other one is of a villa that he designed for his wife, Aziza Hassanin. So this, the context for this first bigger picture of the village, there's an important story here. So in many ways, World War II for Maadi was sort of like a repeat of World War I. And I think for many people who had been optimistic about the potential for sort of this hybrid movement into Egyptian independence, a lot of those hopes were dashed because of the events of World War II. But in Maadi, there's also this other event that really sort of seals that. And that's there is a massive flood like there's a downpour and flood waters flow through the Wadi Digla and into Maadi, and people end up with just like feet of mud in their yards or gardens, even into their homes. But the real devastation comes, there's this village in Maadi, just adjacent to the big suburban development, and it is completely wiped out. So there's all these efforts by the Delta Land Company and various charitable organizations to rebuild. And Hassan Fatih sees this as an opportunity. He has been working with Nubian art builders to kind of come up with this new plan. Historically, building in Egypt has been expensive and difficult because Egypt doesn't have a lot of wood, so wood has to be imported. And this was a way of doing buildings or creating structures that relied on far less wood and had a dome structure that would naturally cool the space. So he develops this whole concept into what he's most famously known for, his architecture for the poor. So Maadi was really his incubator for this whole plan for the architecture of the poor. He brings this plan to Delta Land in the wake of this flood, and he's very optimistic about how it's going to go. And Delta Land actually chooses not to take him up on his plan. And for him, this is devastating and a real evidence of a seemingly sort of intractable divide between foreign interests and local interests, that there was not this willingness to compromise on the Delta Land side. He doesn't give up on his ideas, and he attempts to use them elsewhere, but I want to show he actually does succeed in still building his dome structure with all of its local references for his wife in this other villa he builds in Maadi. And so you see the sort of very similar design patterns between the two structures. And while his bigger plan for the village never takes on, he is still able to build this sort of more elite space in Maadi. And so his vision of a more equitable future, especially one that really inhabits a lot of locally derived trends, it doesn't take off. And I think that is where we start to see Maadi appear a bit behind what a lot of nationalists believed was sort of the future for Egyptians, especially in independent Egypt. So that it's a critical moment in the area's history. The last piece of the puzzle that I think gives us the kind of final story is the college. This is images of Victoria College, which has a different name now, which we will get to. So after World War II, we have a series of critical political events, including the Arab-Israeli War in 1948, and then the end of the capitulations in 1949. So these they reshape the politics of the region. And they reshape the financial linkages of the region. And one of the things now that Delta Land has to do to stick around is appeal to lower income Egyptians. They cannot just stick around. Even with that sort of hybrid model of the interwar years, it's not sustainable anymore. So now we move to this new period, and this is where we get the development of Hadaiq al-Maadi and Digla. So Victoria College is created in Digla. This is important because those two areas had intentionally been left undeveloped by the company. The goal was to keep an undeveloped border around all of Maadi so that it would remain distinct, a kind of island, an idyllic island surrounded by this undeveloped area. So to move out into developing both Hadaiq and Digla is a transformation of Delta Land's vision for Maadi. They're really now just kind of trying to survive, and they're much less wed to their like a very planned community that they had before. But this is also indicative that willingness to develop these areas is indicative of a fundamental shift amongst the leaders of Delta Land. We have one board member who went so far as to suggest the harvesting of Maadi's trees for sale as lumber. Just a very, very different. So Delta Land becomes in many ways a less trustworthy leader for the company or for the town. It's also lost a lot of its authority. Cairo did not have a municipality until the late 1940s as well. And so now that a Cairene municipality is in place, Delta Land can't run the area sort of as its own little mini government. So this college actually in many ways signifies the final transformation of Maadi before the full dissolution of Delta Land and the definitive end of its authority in 1962. This campus, so Victoria College historically had been in Alexandria, but then because of World War II, it was moved to Cairo during the war, and it was initially, its first campus was in Shubra. And after the war, the plan was to kind of disband the college, but there were various interests who wanted to keep it in Cairo, and actually Delta Land is trying to get them to move the campus to a new campus in Digla. And so it was in many ways this, as the name indicates, right, a symbol of British imperialism. You have Victoria College as the name, and it was run by Britons with a British headmaster and mostly British teachers, but the students were mostly from elite Egyptian families. And actually elite families from throughout the region as well, not just Egypt. And for them, it served as a platform for entry into European universities. Basically, the school wants to remain closer to central Cairo, but sort of begrudgingly accepts Delta Land's bid to open up in Shubra, or excuse me, in Digla. And this really actually sets up an important trend for Maadi's future. One of the town's most profitable qualities was its place as a home for families. This is really continuous with the history of the club. And by locating more elite schools, especially international schools in Maadi, this is one of the ways that they hope to ensure that whatever foreign interest remains in Egypt will also come to Maadi. For Americans who are familiar with Maadi, the creation of Victoria College in Digla absolutely set a precedent for other elite international schools like the movement of Cairo American College to the same part of Maadi. Victoria College then was built with a new sort of view of modernity in mind, and this architectural style absolutely stood out from nature as opposed to this very verdant campus. Those of you who know Digla might understand a bit of why that was a pragmatic choice. It just does not have the rich soil for the kind of verdant development that you get in the older parts of Maadi. So this kind of structure fit Digla a bit better, but it also signified kind of a new modern edge. So after the 1952 revolution and the establishment of the Egyptian Republic the following year, obviously explicit references to Victoria had to go. But the college could stay, only it now had to be a symbol of the new nation and state power. So as a savvy and ironic anti-colonial move, Nasser changed the name of the school from Victoria to Victory, and to Kulliyat Nasser. So the symbolism was obvious. I think there's a kind of humorous poetry to it all. For Maadi, for Maadi, this was a profound marker of the transformation of authority. This was a process then that would continue to unfold more on economic terms than political, especially following the nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956. Those events take us then to 1962, the end of Delta land, which had already really distanced itself from Maadi's originally intended form. By 1962, the people most invested in Maadi and its special sort of cosmopolitan, garden oriented existence, that previous existence that really came to life in the interwar period, their residents, those long-term residents who live there, even people who moved there in the 1940s, they are the ones heavily invested in Maadi's preservation, more so than people involved in Delta land. To conclude, if we think about the architectural record, the two villas I showed have since been demolished. Only the club and the college remain, but in, of course, quite changed form. But by tracing those alternative dates, one's tied to a kind of economic and financial authority in Egypt that eventually collapses. We get through Maadi a bigger story of cultural and political transformation. And this story is written into the landscape, and you can still see it in Maadi today. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to your questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. Thank you, Annalise, for that fascinating lecture. I'd like to begin by asking a question which was submitted before this talk. It came to us from one of our viewers. We often hear in Maadi that it was built by the Freemasons and that it was chosen because of the positive energy grids in the ground. We also hear that the grid system of the street numbers is based on other cities that the Freemasons built in the West. Another popular legend is that the US government club, the Maadi House, was bought from a Swiss Jewish couple for a bargain because they had to flee Nasser's Egypt. Is there any truth to either of these legends or myths?
So I'll start with the Freemason one. Especially the British imperial authorities, the civil servants involved in the empire, most of them were Freemasons. I don't have any archival evidence that their participation in the Freemasons had any impact on Maadi. Actually, we can say pretty conclusively that there was no real connection there, because the reason that Maadi is where it is because of the Jewish founders, which this is a great way to kind of bring that story in. So the way that Maadi comes into being is that these former civil servants who worked for the British government kind of leave and start working in banking and finance. They wed their interest to a lot of existing financial networks, largely Jewish financial networks. And the Egyptian Jews have a long history south of Cairo. And so those lands are much more familiar to them, and several of them actually own large chunks of land that they sell to Delta Land for the development of Maadi. So that's sort of the actual way that it all comes into being. And you can tell much of Maadi's story, and through the book you see this is one of the sort of threads that runs throughout. These years also are really significant years to Egyptian Jewish history. So they also, because of their significance to the Egyptian economy and to Egyptian governments, are heavily involved in this view of Egyptian modernity that's tied up in Maadi. With the house, that I don't know for sure, but it's very likely. We start to see, so not a lot of we see more foreigners leave around 1949, but a lot of Jews stay and until 1956, especially if they had French or British citizenship, then they had to leave. And so there is like the Egyptian military visited a lot of these Jewish homes, and they were forced out. When they left, it was quite fly by night. So a whole asset, like homes, other assets were left with families that could stay with friends, neighbors, in hopes that they could sell that and they could kind of recoup some of the money.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another question. My question is for the author. I wonder if my grandparents are mentioned in her book. My Swiss-German grandmother, Maria Theresa Neidhart, married to my grandfather, Professor Hussein Fuad Negati, professor of parasitology, expert for the United Nations, WHO and FAO. They lived in Maadi in the late 30s next to the Jewish synagogue, Road Museri. Then the building was built by Mr. Betten.
So that's a great connection to Egyptian Jewish history, actually, because Moseri was one of the Jewish founders, so that road was named after him. And then Beiten was the architect for Delta Land, and he actually designed all sorts of buildings, homes, and then the synagogue is he designed, and it's named after him. So unfortunately their particular history isn't in the book, but what I'll say is that the book does include basically much of what their experience in Maadi would have been like. So even if, it would be impossible to kind of catalog all of these stories, but my goal was to really showcase representative stories so that people with connections to family or family histories in Maadi would get a sense of what their family experience was like, even if their family isn't actually focused on in the book.
Thank you very much. We have a question. Do you have an idea about the composition of the population in terms of foreign nationalities and Egyptians, the kind of percentages? I guess that must have changed over time.
Yeah, so it basically starts out heavily foreign and then becomes almost completely Egyptian. Not entirely. I mentioned Cairo American College. We do start to get more Americans showing up in the 1950s, especially with oil interests, but they don't stay. The Americans tend to be more itinerant, so they'll come for a little while. This is still true in Maadi today. They'll come for a stint for maybe 8 years and then leave. So it's a very different kind of experience than these resident foreigners who their view is not to leave, but to stay. I don't have the specific number. It would be hard to, because it's a very much a moving target. I do have in the book some like real clear demographic snapshots, but because the governance that Maadi was included in actually switches over time, and so just even getting its particular numbers was harder than I had expected.
Thank you. Another question. Excuse me. I'm reading the book. First of all, congratulations. I'm reading the book and it's really interesting. As you also teach women's history, could you tell us a little bit about women's role in Maadi's development, and the role in its development throughout the different historical phases? Thank you.
So because Maadi was a place for families, women were integral to its development. Without it, there's a lot of these villas, because they're so large, are multi-generational households for a lot of the Egyptian families. So you have grandparents there as well, and then of course you also have servants in these homes too. So they are their own little social world in each of the homes. But women are involved in Maadi in a number of ways, and actually where it comes up most frequently is their involvement and commitment to the environment of Maadi, especially the gardens of Maadi. So this starts out as kind of, it's never really a solely British interest, but it's very much that moment of like complex, like American women, Egyptian women, and men, and then a lot of European women who are all very involved in various gardening endeavors, and they have their Maadi is like overrepresented in the Egyptian Horticultural Society. And one Maadi woman, a woman named Mary Stout, writes this whole gardening guide that actually is it tells us a lot about the environmental history of that moment, that especially in the interwar period in Egypt. But later on, it's a lot of women who grew up in Maadi become very, very involved in its preservation. And a lot of those preservation efforts are driven by women. I see women's influence in several of those areas. There are also some just really interesting characters who stand out. There's one woman who lived there really her entire adult life. She's French. Her name was Henriette Devonshire. She married a British man. She was like a local fixture in terms of the medieval history of Cairo, and she led weekly tours of the medieval monuments of Cairo and published like 7 books on it. And so she's this sort of fascinating character in and of herself. She was actually an active gardener too, but that wasn't her real legacy. We have those kind of, but more than just the women who stand out as just individual characters who are really fascinating, more broader in terms of trends, women are heavily involved in the environmental preservation of Maadi and can actually continue to be.
Well, your book really brings those characters to life, I have to say. You can really see them, imagine them. So we have a question. How did you become interested in the history of Maadi? That's actually a question I want to ask.
This is a good question. So I first visited Maadi when I was 17 years old. And actually my interest came because I have an uncle who worked in the oil industry. And so we were visiting family who lived in Maadi. And so when I was starting my PhD, there's a lot of discussion about empire and the various forms of empire. And I just felt like this business history was not quite like, especially the way the business history really affects people and like families and the social effect of these business relationships. I just felt like it wasn't as prominent. And so as I started thinking more and more about this neighborhood that I had, been to, and that it was this expat space. And the more I dug into the history, I was like, oh, this really shows that like there's quite a bit more. It's quite a bit more complex a story than just here's your nationalists and here's your imperialists, and they're just inherently at war with each other. Like there's all sorts of mixing, but not necessarily on that political level. You've got to take it down to these other ways of seeing. And Maadi just told that story. And I initially thought I would need to compare it to Heliopolis and Garden City, but there really proved to be enough material just to tell the story of Maadi, which is what I had hoped from the beginning. So those two neighborhoods are very similar, founded around the same time, but they kind of lose their distinctions even earlier than Maadi.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one last question, a very short question. Do you believe the college and club will also be demolished? That's kind of. I don't see no reason.
I don't see any reason to think that they would at this point. The college is not a open social space anymore, but it's just it is there. In some ways, I'd almost have to defer to someone who like is like on the ground in Maadi now. But because they've been around this long, and actually because there are certain policies in place that like where it's more difficult to tear down some of these older buildings and instead you get kind of things constructed around them, I don't see any reason to think that they'll go anywhere anytime soon.
Okay, that's good news. Well, we have another question. What is your plan for the next book? Is there a part 2?
So I don't, the next book, it actually tells a story of a man who didn't fit into this book. He's an American inventor around the same time as Edison, from Philadelphia, like Thomas Edison. And he was very, very concerned about the overuse of coal and was convinced that this would, lead to environmental devastation. And so he became very invested in solar power. And he creates this solar engine that can pump water. And his hope is to sell it to the British Empire so they can use it across the Middle East and in India. So that's the next sort of project, is telling his story, but not just his story, but actually his story in connection with views of the environment. And he's still an imperialist. He still believes in the empire, right? He's not necessarily invested in like solar or renewable energy for the sake of these colonized parts of the world, right? So I think there's a lot to kind of unpack there about what these other views of sustainability and what he was trying to do. Anyway, the British switched their fleet from coal to oil during World War I, and he passes away during the war as well. And so he just sort of is one of these fascinating figures in history who kind of just falls out of the history books. So he didn't fit into this big story, so I want to still tell his story.
Oh, that sounds good. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Annalise, for this fascinating lecture and for taking the questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, this morning, depending on which time. And please read this book. It's really, really, really good. Okay.
Thank you, Nadia, for the wonderful moderation you did, and Annalise for the wonderful discussion. You have a lot of people interested, and I'm sure we have more questions to come from our followers. Annalise, if you don't mind, if we can post your email, if someone want to reach out to you with a story about Maadi or something that's useful for your book. I'm just gonna add it into our Facebook page, AUC Press, on our Facebook page, and also I'll add it here in the chat box for everyone if they'd like to reach out to Annalise. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I just want to paste your email. Just a second. Can you just say your email and I'll type it for anyone?
ADEVRIES at Samford.edu.
Perfect. Here it is for everyone. If you'd like to send out any emails to Annalise, I'm sure she'll be happy to answer and get back to their inquiries. Thank you so much, Annalise, for your time. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, everyone, for watching. And the video is going to be on our Facebook page and YouTube channel very shortly, so you could watch it again and see any details that you might have missed or anything. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.